Thank you very much indeed for those extraordinarily kind words. It's a great pleasure and honour to give this Emden lecture. Now, the Second World War has been particularly present in the past few months. The Foreign Secretary called on the Prime Minister to invoke the Dunkirk spirit. At the same Tory party conference, one person said, "We have paid our debt to Europe in World War II," implying that nothing was owed in the withdrawal agreement. And a retired Tory accountant from Hornchurch was reported to believe that we had nothing to fear from a hard Brexit because we had, after all, fed ourselves in World War II. Now, I don't want to join a chorus claiming Brexiteers are deranged, deluded deplorables with no understanding of history. Rather, I want to ask how it can be that honest people, I assume they're all honest people, can believe that the Second World War saw a national rebirth, for some indeed the birth of the British nation itself, or indeed that the British nation fed itself in those years. And my answer is that the histories, good histories by good historians, once told us this, or at least appeared to. And I want to explore this by looking at two notions said to be central to British self-understanding during the war. The idea that Britain stood alone in 1940 and that it went on to fight from 1940 a people's war. Now, if I were to ask a professional historian, do you think that Britain was alone in 1940? They would say, well, of course not. There was the Empire. There was the United States of America. Help came from outside. Asked whether they thought Britain had fought a people's war, they would say, well, no, not really. This is what propaganda said. But it was by no reasonable standard a genuine people's war. But if one asks these same historians, did people at the time believe that Britain was alone and that they were fighting a people's war? They would say yes. They did believe that. And they would add, since the 1960s, historians have debunked that notion. I want to argue a very different conclusion. My title alludes to one of the key debunking books, Angus Calder's Myth of the Blitz, which has a go precisely at alone and people's war as myths from the war itself. I want to argue that that's wrong, that the war was understood at the time as imperial and internationalist, not as a national war. Britain was not alone, could not have been alone. The People's War was a rare expression and meant something different from what it means for the historians today. It was only after the Second World War that the idea of a national war in which Britain had been alone and fought a people's war arose. First to be celebrated and then to be dismissed as wartime propaganda. Let me start with alone. The idea that something called Britain stood alone is supposed to be in Churchill's rhetoric, in official propaganda, and in the famous Lowe cartoon, this one, and generally so obviously that evidence doesn't need to be adduced to support this notion. And indeed, we have this famous cartoon, very well alone. Well, what is it? What is it that's alone? Actually, some months after this was published in the Evening Standard, Lowe collected cartoons and added a little note to this image, which is this, it goes as follows. It's too small, I'll read it out. Assured of increasing support in supplies and munitions from the United States, and especially of planes and pilots from the Dominions, Britain determined to fight on alone. Now, that suggests a national conception of alone, but is contradicted by the evidence of not in fact being alone. But my point is that national conception of being alone, that is sort of there, is actually very rare. Now, what is common is the image of the fortress, the image of the citadel, the bastion, the garrison, the white cliffs of Dover as ramparts. But such images were not usually associated with a nation, but with something bigger. Empire, Europe, European civilization, freedom, perhaps even Christendom. This does not in itself imply a nation alone. Now let me give you some examples of that. J.B. Priestley's radio postscripts have no national alone, but invoke empire and commonwealth repeatedly, and the fortress image as well. For example, on 9th of June 1940, he spoke of wishing to send all our children out of this island to the wide dominions and turning Britain into the greatest fortress the world has ever known. And the 1st of September, he noted his surprise that the British Commonwealth alone would be defying both the Nazis and the fascists. So there is something that's alone, but it's something much bigger than Britain. And indeed, the notion of the empire being alone was to be found, for example, in this cartoon by Fougas. You can't read it, perhaps at the very bottom it says, "So, our poor old empire is alone in the world. Aye, we are, the whole 500 million of us." And you won't be able to see this, but I think there's a naval ship on the horizon there, protecting our two rather laid-back soldiers. So, the empire was sometimes alone. For example, as France was falling, the Times carried the message, "We fight on," but the "we" was an imperial one. In Parliament on the 18th of June, in his Finest Hour speech, reporting on the Finest Hour speech, the Times spoke of, headlined, "British Empire to fight on," and again, "our island garrison." That image. And Churchill himself indicated that the empire would fight on if necessary, and if necessary, alone. And in the Few speech in August 1940, he referred to the British nation and the British Empire finding themselves alone. Now this is hardly surprising. Churchill was an imperialist, the Conservative Party was an imperialist party. You could not ignore the existence of the empire. And indeed, at the end of the war, in his official declaration given in the House of Commons, he recounted the story as follows. "After gallant France had been struck down, we, from this island and from our united empire, maintained the struggle single-handed for a whole year until we were joined by the military might of Soviet Russia." Exactly what you would expect. What you might not expect is that in propaganda the standard presentation was not in fact that the empire was alone, but rather that it had European allies. For example, in its Out of the People 1941, J.B. Priestley does not use the term alone, but he said this: "The very core, the hard centre of world resistance to the Nazis is found in this real England, this democratic industrial England." World resistance. Another example, a rather telling one. The BBC broadcast a popular national anthems programme on Sunday before the 9 o'clock radio news. It played the national anthems of Allied nations. On the 12th of May 1940, the anthems of the Netherlands and Belgium were added to this programme. Many others followed, until the programme was forced off the air in June 1941, as it was deemed unacceptable to play the Internationale on BBC. Thus it was that the Allied nations' national anthems were only on the air in the supposedly alone years. Indeed, once one looks again and again, the war is presented in 1940 as a European war, as a European civil war, rather than as a war of nations. The Bolting brothers film Dawn Guard of 1941, for example, has a Home Guard soldier noting that Europeans have united to fight Hitler, a scene set after Dunkirk. And lots of newsreels from this period will show Churchill with Generals de Gaulle and Sikorsky looking at tanks, and they're obviously allies. Indeed, there was in fact an inter-allied conference called exactly that on the 12th of June 1941. And the British Gaumont newsreel reported that spoke of all the nations that stand beside Britain in the fight against Nazism, and reported a vigorous speech by Churchill denouncing the vile race of quislings who were collaborating with them. And the conference brought together British Empire leaders and heads of government in exile. And, well, that's the Empire. Let me just go straight on to this one. This is a poster illustrating exactly that. Munition workers of Allied countries are hitting back at Hitler through British factories. And this is pre-June 1941. As you can see, there are lots of flags. You won't find the flag of the Soviet Union there, but you find the Greek flag, the Yugoslav flag, and so on. So the Allies were in existence. Now the left, as one would expect, did not speak of the nation being alone, but of a common struggle against fascism. George Orwell's line, "The unicorn," often cited as an example of this national feeling, not only includes the empire, as might be expected, but talks about the Chinese fighting fascism and the engagement of the Greeks. And Clement Attlee, making a speech to the Labour Party conference just before Barbarossa, noted the following: "Outside this country, most people thought that Britain was hopelessly beaten. It looked as if we stood alone, but we were not alone. We had the other countries of the British Commonwealth and the peoples of the Empire. We had something more than that. We had the sympathies of all the lovers of freedom all over the world." Now, the most interesting thing for me about that is that Attlee is using a national rather than an imperial we, but the nation is not alone. How might we conclude? Well, there is the odd, confused national alone, as in low. There may have been, though I haven't found it yet, a private sense, people being in a nation that was alone. But that is not the message found in Churchillian rhetoric or in state propaganda. Here, the focus was on imperial alone, and more commonly, on not being alone at all, but rather being part of an international struggle against fascism. And indeed, especially from 1942, internationalism rather than imperialism would come to the fore. What then about People's War? In contrast to the case of alone, historians have stated clearly and influentially that People's War was a common wartime usage. Angus Calder claimed that from 1940, People's War was a phrase which stuck. It became a cliché, indeed. For Paul Addison, it was a new phrase on the lips of speakers, which encapsulated the leftward shift of 1940. Malcolm Smith gives it a Marxist origin and suggested again that it was widely used by the end of 1940. But if one looks at newspapers, one finds it's actually a rarely used expression. The Times and the Manchester Guardian each used it only about 40 times in the entire war, at least in my calculation. And it's not used where you might expect it to be used, given the nature of Calder and Addison's argument. It's not in Guilty Men, it's not in Priestley's postscripts, it's not in George Orwell. In fact, it's hardly anywhere. And the meaning is not what we might expect it to be. It is essentially, certainly in 1940, a synonym for total war, which is used at least 10 times as often as People's War. What does total war, People's War / total war mean? It means mass war in which everybody is involved. It echoes the Volkskrieg or the Leviathan. It is a term that's used to describe lots of different sorts of wars by lots of different people. It was used in this sense during and of the Great War, of Franco's war in Spain, and by both the British and German propaganda ministers in the Second World War. I mean Joseph Goebbels and Sir John Reith. And it was used meaning a nation in arms in government leaflets calling for the creation of the Home Guard, and speeches by the Minister of War. It's used in the sense that everybody is involved when you have indiscriminate bombing. It's straightforwardly total war. It's used especially strongly for example, the nature of the war waging in Russia from June 1941, but it's used equally by the left and the right. It's just total. But there are other senses in play. The left use the term, not very much, in an internationalist sense rather than national or nationalist one, to mean a war of the peoples of the world against fascism. And an early example of that is Francis Williams's War by Revolution of 1940, which noted this must be a people's war, and a people's war is only possible as an international war. And Clement Attlee, reporting on an international labour organisation meeting in the United States in late 1941, noted, this is a people's war. What is at stake is what kind of life shall be lived in future by the ordinary man and woman all over the world. And that internationalist sense of people's war is, I think, the dominant one, found again and again, especially from 1942 onwards. And it appears in expressions like people's war and a people's peace, which doesn't refer to the national situation, but to a global situation. Now, this usage makes perfect sense, as internationalism, as is now being recognised, was a very important feature of wartime propaganda, especially from January 1942, with the creation of the so-called United Nations, the nations that had signed up to the Atlantic Charter. There were ceremonies commemorating the United Nations in 1942 and 43, which may well have overshadowed Empire Day. And there was indeed a great deal of enthusiasm for organisations like the Federal Union, which included William Beveridge, a committed liberal internationalist. And it's notable that broadcasting on his famous report at the end of 1942, he topped and tailed this talk by referring to the very same Atlantic Charter. It's an internationalist, not a nationalist perspective. Now, the left did not apply the term People's War to describe what was happening within the United Kingdom. On the contrary, it was a critical rather than a celebratory concept. The view of some on the left was that the United Kingdom or the British Empire was not fighting a people's war, but ought to. And this is exactly the position of Tom Wintringham, who saw the Spanish Civil War as a civil war, but argued that the British were absolutely not fighting a people's war. People's war is what being fought by the Russians and the Chinese. The British were fighting an imperial war, perhaps an imperialist war. He wanted to change that. More general notion of what People's War should be was central to the programme of the Commonwealth Party, of which Tom Wintringham became a leading member. In its national campaign of August 1942, it proclaimed, "This must be made a people's war." And one candidate for the Commonwealth Party, speaking in a leaflet for a by-election in 1943, declared, "We want a people's war, no more Darlands, closer cooperation with Russia, a total effort with ruthless cutting of hindrance by big business, immediate nationalisation of the mines." None of that was happening. That's what he wanted. And he wanted also a people's peace. The Beveridge report in full, common ownership of the great resources. And Ritchie Calder himself uses the term people's war in a critical sense when he's talking about the lack of response, a lack of help given to the many poor that were bombed out of London. A people's war demanded that one did better. In fact, the only wartime case I know of the positive application of the term to Britain was a 1945 election leaflet in which a communist candidate declared, "It was a people's war, it's been a people's victory." only later would it generally be rendered as a positive description of wartime Britain, especially, and ironically enough, by the historian of Commonwealth Party, son of Richard Calder, Angus Calder. So what I'm suggesting is the following. If anything was alone in 1940, it was the empire, not the nation. The People's War was a synonym for the more common term total war, and it became an internationalist term after that, a term of criticism if applied to the British case. Now, it seems to me that this makes perfect sense in terms of what was going on during the war itself. It was hardly possible, politically or ideologically, to ignore the fact that the United Kingdom was part of an empire which in its entirety had declared war on Nazism. It was impossible too to ignore the Free French, the Poles, the Greeks, the importance of the Norwegian merchant marine, the Greek merchant marine, or the Dutch and Belgian overseas territories which were committed to the Allied cause before June 1941. Internationalism was for real. It was a war of many peoples around the world. And as far as the United Kingdom was concerned, the internationalism of the war affected the national capacity for war very directly. I don't simply mean that there were many foreign and imperial troops on British soil. I mean that the whole British war effort, its exceptional degree of mobilisation, was utterly dependent on Allies' contributions to that mobilisation. The high mobilisation was not the result of national effort, but rather of an international commitment to supply the United Kingdom so that it could mobilise. So let's make a brief point about food supplies, in case there are any retired Conservative Brexiteer accountants in the audience. There was an increase in domestic food production, wheat and potatoes and so on, but the United Kingdom still depended on imports, as we should all know. Indeed, in the cases of meat and cheese, production actually shifted abroad. Furthermore, much of the food came in free from the United States and Canada, or was paid for by deferred expenditure if it came from Argentina, Uruguay, Australia, New Zealand. The United Kingdom remained the largest importer of food in the world in the middle of the Second World War. The first Brexit, or is it the third Brexit or the fourth Brexit of 1940, was a moment of catastrophic decline in British power, a moment which led to new dependence on the rest of the world. And if it wasn't dependent, it was only so because it had enormous power as a customer. So what I'm saying is this, that understanding the war as imperial and international and internationalist is crucial. And so is understanding that this was how the war was presented at the time. So, how did the national alone and the national people's war come into the story? Well, on Victory in Europe Day, Churchill gave his account of the war in which a united empire had fought on alone that I quoted earlier. On the same day, he made a brief speech to the crowds in Whitehall, in which alone referred to the British nation, quotes, and this ancient island, not the empire. And it was probably no mistake. For the Conservative Party manifesto in July 1945, Churchill used a national rather than an imperial we. During the whole year of this great war, he said, Britain bore the burden of the struggle alone. Noted of the Empire and Commonwealth that we shall never forget their love and steadfastness when we stood alone against the German terror. These were extraordinary sentiments for a leader of an imperialist party to express, and were notably different from the arguments presented by the Liberal and Labour parties. The Liberal Party celebrated the fact that the people of these islands, the British Commonwealth and Empire, for standing alone for a whole year against the insolent might of Germany. And the Labour Manifesto, though full of references to the nation and the people, had no alone, only the spirit of Dunkirk and the Blitz, and no empire to reference, no reference to the empire at all, but barest citation of the role of the Dominions, India, and the colonial dependencies. So it's not always there in 1945. Now, alone was soon to appear in some, but not all, histories of the war. It's there very clearly in Churchill's history, in the volume, the second volume published in 1949. He has inscribed at the front of that volume how the British people held the fort, again that garrison image, alone, till those who had hitherto been half blind were half ready, that is, without the United States. There is a certain ambiguity in the British people, but the second half of that volume is entitled Alone, and makes very clear that he's referring there to a national, not an imperial alone. And indeed, in a number of other books in the late 1940s, we find a national alone. But in the first civil official history, Keith Hancock and my old teacher Margaret Gowing's British War Economy, we find this. 1949. Even in the darkest months of 1940 and 1941, the United Kingdom did not fight alone. The resisting European governments found sanctuary in Britain. Small bands of fighting Frenchmen, Poles, Norwegians, Dutch, Belgians and Czechs took up battle stations with the British forces, while in their subdued homelands, obstinate patriots tuned into Big Ben and formed with each other those first conspiratorial groupings that grew later into the resistance. And the empire was not forgotten either. In the year of decision, 1940, Britain was not an isolated island, they said, but the rallying centre of Commonwealth and Empire. It's utterly straightforward and clear, and indeed they make the point that internationalism was central to British capacity to wage war. And over the following decade or so, historians followed Hancock and Gowing more than they followed Churchill. Rather nicely, a 1950s edition of H.E. Marshall's Our Island Story has no 1940 alone at all. Instead of 1939, Britain was not alone. Not only had Canada, New Zealand and the other dominions declared war on Germany, but so had Britain's old ally, France. And Charles Mowat, though he used alone in his 1955 history, noted that there remained alone Britain and the Commonwealth, together with those patriots who had escaped Nazi occupation, i.e. not a nation alone at all. And if one goes through the books, for example, Henry Pelling's Modern Britain, there is no alone there. Alone appears in the 1960s. It appears in Wheeler Bennett's biography of George VI, which claimed something the king could never have uttered in public during the war. Quote, Britain now stood alone in the fight, stripped and girt for battle, and unimpeded by less determined friends. Unthinkable in 1940. A.J.P. Taylor has Britain alone, or Great Britain alone. Angus Calder, in his People's War, notes in inverted commas that Britain stood alone, noting that Britain fought alone, without inverted commas. And he criticises the notion of alone for excluding millions of Asians. An odd point, because it excluded many others too. But it's interesting that he assumes the alone to be a national alone, not an imperial alone. As he had to, given that his book was an intensely national history of the war effort. Now, from the late 60s, many works assert that, for example, in Arthur Marwick, the British people stood alone, and there's no ambiguity there. Thames Television's History of the Second World War, the World at War, a marvellous series, entitled its fourth episode, Alone, running from May 1940 to May 1941. An Oxford historian of distinction was not unusual amongst historians in the 1990s. in claiming at 1940 that truly the nation was alone. And it was not a lack of expertise in British history which led Simon Sharma to tell the nation on television that in the year 1940, the complete isolation of Britain, fighting on alone, which Hitler not unreasonably assumed would make it a soft target, had precisely the reverse effect. Churchill turned on the island nation rhetoric, and the British people across all classes, with very few exceptions, echoed. Well, maybe. Now, I'm not wanting to suggest that all post-war historians after 1965 said this sort of thing, though most do, as it happens. One gets qualifications, not alone because of the Commonwealth, not alone because of the United States. Odd reference to governments in exile, very rare. But it is extremely rare to see the argument that the whole empire, not just the Britain and the Dominions, were alone. And rarer still, note that this empire had allies. Indeed, one of the few people that does this is, ironically enough, you might think, Andrew Roberts. Not a figure of the left, not someone one would have thought of as an internationalist. So by the 1970s, empire and Europe truly were written out of British history, which became intensely national. Now, how was the People's War invented as a notion? Well, it's not there in the 40s, it's not there in the 1950s. The first use I can find is A.J.P. Taylor's English history. This was a People's War, imperial greatness was on the way out, the welfare state was on the way in. In Angus Calder's People's War, Addison's wrote in 1945, the phrase is used, though sparingly, as it happens. It is, of course, Calder's title. But the significance of the term is clear. Paul Addison defined the meaning of People's War indirectly, but clearly, connecting it to 1940, to the nation, and to the left. Indeed, People's War, I would argue, becomes a way of describing the war effort focused on the development of the welfare state, focused on the progressive forces in 20th century Britain, and focused on the domestic economy on the home front. People's War was progressive war. People's War became the war the British had supposedly fought. And these accounts were profoundly national. The unit of analysis is Britain or something like it, not the empire. And these books celebrate the coming together of the nation, a nation gaining strength by turning inward, mobilizing national resources to transform its fighting capacity. And there are many such stories of a national People's War as a successful war effort, as a peculiarly successful effort in 20th century British history, and it always dates from 1940 and not from 1939. Now, it's not actually till the 1980s and really the 1990s that the term People's War, understood in just this sense, has spread far and wide. What it means is unspecified because it doesn't have to be. It's clear, it's understood. What it stands for is the Taylor, Calder, Addison account of the war made into historical reality. It's shorthand for the history of the war given by these writers as if it were a contemporary account and indeed an unchallengeable account of the war. Now, there is a shift. Alone in People's War come to be seen as wartime propaganda and not reality. And Angus Calder's Myth of the Blitz is critical here, published in 1991. It's a pioneering cultural history which looks at the contemporary meaning of 1940 and the war more generally. Both Alone and People's War are very present in his argument. Alone is part of a chapter heading. He stresses the empire was important, the foreigners flew in the Battle of Britain, a weak challenge to the notion of alone. But he insists that alone is a myth. He has an index entry, goes as follows: People's War, myth of, with many pages cited. But nowhere in this book, which looks potentially at primary sources, does he observe that the central elements of what he sees as the myth of 1940 created in 1940, excepting one lone reference to People's War, is absent from his sources. It's just not there. So too is any acknowledgement of his own pivotal role in creating the understanding of the war as a national people's. And by the way, the myth of the Blitz was covering up what he saw as the reality, which is the transfer of power from London to Washington in 1940. It's a potent myth with potent effects. Now that work, called as 1991, set the tone for literature, much subsequent literature, which argued for the centrality of alone and People's War to wartime ideology. Myths which covered up less exalted realities. Sonia Rosier's Which People's War challenges what she takes as perceptions of the People's War, but puts the concept itself at the centre of wartime ideas, taking it for granted that the war was usually described in those terms at the time. And what were those terms? Well, the idea that the left was ascendant, it was a left view focused on the rebuilding of Britain. The idea that a new Britain would rise like a phoenix from the ashes of war, she says, was a powerful one that dominated the hopes and fears articulated in popular discourse. That hid the reality of continued inequalities. So, what I'm suggesting is that we have a really extremely weird account of the Second World War. First, a national one, then one in which it is believed at wartime people were deluded by nationalist propaganda, and that these delusions are still out there, poisoning our understanding of our place in the world. They are delusions, but they are not, I'm suggesting, wartime ones. How are we to understand the shift? My answer, which I set out in my book, Rise and Fall of the British Nation, is that there was a profound general nationalisation of Britain and of the British story after 1945. A new British nation told a national story of what it took to be its foundational moment. It was a matter writing actually largely from the left, at least as much, I think, as from the right. Indeed, the domestic history of the left, the domestic history of the war has been written almost entirely from the left. Indeed, it's rather striking that there is a standing rebuke to post-war efforts, even those of Labour governments, evoked by pointing to the national effort of 1940 in particular. The spirit of 1945 turns out to be largely the spirit of 1940. It was a retrospective creation of a nation out of empire, out of internationalism too. And this reflected the creation after the war of a national, non-imperial, significant extent, less internationalised economy. There was a projection back onto the war of a real post-war phenomenon. One Nation Labour, Harold Wilson in 1974. Actually, I want to suggest the great bearers of the national project after 1945 are the Labour Party. The Labour Party is in many respects a nationalist party, as well as being a social democratic party. Let me return to our retired accountant and Brexiteer who claimed the UK fed itself during the war. It didn't, as we've seen, but post-war Britain did come to feed itself by the 1980s. In the 1980s, the United Kingdom became what would have been unthinkable during the war, an exporter of meat and wheat. Mrs. Thatcher presided over peak cattle in the entire history of the United Kingdom. Essentially, 80% more, in some calculations, self-sufficient in food in the 1980s. So, that national story that was told retrospectively came to be seen as a bad one, merely wartime propaganda, hiding the realities of empire, of allies, of continuing inequality. Britain was living and continued to live, it was suggested, with nationalist delusions, which were really perhaps imperial delusions. And we can see an echo of that in the view that Brexit is a case of empire striking back. Actually, if anything is striking back, it is not imperialism, but nationalism. And as I hope I've shown, that nationalism was not characteristic of the war, but of invocations of wartime nationalism were characteristic of a real but neglected post-war nationalism. We should therefore beware the invocation of histories of the Second World War in our politics, but we need to beware also of academic history, this one included.